My younger brother Declan Mercer spent nearly $200,000 of our dying grandmother's savings on online gambling, and when I exposed him, my parents accused me of being cruel. That was the moment I finally understood that Declan could lose every dollar, betray every person who trusted him, and still remain their golden child. Growing up, he could do nothing wrong in our parents' eyes, while everything I did was somehow disappointing or not quite good enough. Declan skipped family dinners to hang out with friends, and Mom would smile and say he needed an active social life. When I missed dinner because of drama club, she accused me of choosing strangers over precious family time. He was caught cheating on 3 tests in high school, and Dad called the principal to explain that Declan was simply overwhelmed by the pressure of being so talented. When I earned a B+ in chemistry, my parents hired a tutor because they were worried I was falling behind. Declan crashed his car after drinking when he was 19. They handled the damage quietly, protected him from as many consequences as they could, and bought him a new truck because he had supposedly learned his lesson and needed dependable transportation. When I accidentally scraped the garage door, they made me pay for the repairs from my part-time wages because, according to Dad, responsibility built character. Declan dropped out of college after 2 semesters, and they praised him for having the courage to find himself. I graduated with honors, and Mom remarked that anyone could get good grades if they had no social life and spent all their time studying. When Declan decided he wanted to become a musician, our parents converted the garage into a recording studio. He barely practiced, never finished a song, and abandoned the idea within months. When I asked for help with my student loans, they told me they had to be smart with money and that independence would make me stronger. The favoritism was so constant that for years, I treated it like bad weather. I hated it, but I assumed there was nothing I could do except endure it. Declan stole cash from Mom's purse, and whenever she noticed money missing, she convinced herself she must have spent it and forgotten. Jewelry disappeared, and she decided she had misplaced it. Dad's tools vanished from the garage, and he assumed he had loaned them to someone. I pointed out the obvious pattern more than once, but my parents accused me of jealousy and said I was always looking for reasons to make my brother seem irresponsible. Declan persuaded them to give him $20,000 from their retirement savings to start a business. The business collapsed in 3 months, and my parents said failure was the best teacher, and at least he had been brave enough to try. During that same period, I asked for $1,000 to take a professional certification course that could improve my career. They told me finances were tight and suggested I ask again the following year. I learned early that Declan's failures were investments, while my ambitions were unnecessary expenses. He also borrowed money from relatives, made promises he never kept, and always had a new emergency ready when someone asked about repayment. At the time, none of us understood the full scale of what he was doing. Each relative thought their loan was an isolated favor. Declan was careful to tell different stories to different people, and because my parents defended him so aggressively, most of us doubted our own suspicions before we doubted him. The breaking point came when our paternal grandmother, Alma Mercer, became seriously ill. Grandma Alma needed increasing help with meals, transportation, medication, household bills, and eventually full-time care. She had saved approximately $200,000 over her lifetime, and had always said she intended to divide whatever remained equally among her grandchildren. As soon as her health declined, Declan transformed himself into the devoted grandson. He began visiting Grandma almost every day, and volunteered to manage her finances because, as he told the family, everyone else was too busy and she was becoming overwhelmed. My parents praised him constantly. Mom called him mature and compassionate. Dad said Declan was finally stepping up when the family needed him most. Because Grandma was growing forgetful, Declan persuaded her to sign a power of attorney, allowing him to pay bills and manage her accounts. He presented it as a practical way to protect her from missed payments and financial mistakes. At first, I wanted to believe him. I was tired of being the suspicious brother, and part of me hoped he had finally found a responsibility serious enough to change him. Within 3 months, however, Grandma's savings began disappearing at an alarming rate. Declan claimed the money was being used for medical care, groceries, utilities, household maintenance, and other needs. Whenever anyone asked for receipts, he became offended and said keeping perfect records was impossible while caring for a dying relative. He told us he was buying Grandma organic food, but her kitchen was stocked with generic bread, canned soup, and the cheapest groceries available. During cold weather, she complained that the house was freezing because Declan said the heating bill was too expensive. She wore the same clothes repeatedly because he told her there was no room in the budget for anything new. My parents refused to question him. To them, asking for records meant insulting the wonderful grandson who had sacrificed so much of his time. Grandma died 6 months after Declan took control of her finances. When the estate was reviewed, only about $10,000 remained. The attorney handling the estate noted that there had been unusually large transfers, but because Declan held power of attorney, the transactions required a closer investigation before anyone could determine whether he had exceeded his authority. My parents immediately treated that uncertainty as proof of his innocence. They said the money must have gone toward Grandma's care and insisted that the rest of us should be grateful Declan had been there for her. A few days later, my cousin Marisol pulled me aside. She worked at the bank where Grandma kept her accounts, and she had encountered the transfers while performing her job. She explained that she had documented the activity through the bank's procedures for suspected exploitation of an elderly customer. What she had seen was not a series of payments to doctors, pharmacies, utility companies, or caregivers. Money had been moving from Grandma's account into Declan's personal accounts, and then often within hours to an online gambling service called BetKing Casino. Marisol had a transaction timeline showing the dates, amounts, and destinations. The pattern was devastatingly clear. $50,000 left Grandma's account on January 10th and entered Declan's account. 3 hours later, the same amount went to BetKing. Another $30,000 moved on January 25th. $40,000 followed on February 3rd, then $25,000 on February 18th. Smaller transfers continued almost daily as Grandma's condition worsened. By the end, Declan had gambled away close to $200,000 in 6 months, while Grandma sat in a cold house eating cheap food because he claimed her savings could not cover basic comfort. I read the transaction list several times, hoping I had misunderstood it. I had spent my entire life watching my parents excuse Declan's behavior, but even I had not imagined he would steal from a dying woman who trusted him. Marisol said the bank records matched the gambling transfers down to the hour. She had been documenting the suspicious pattern, but the power of attorney paperwork and internal reporting process meant the situation had not been resolved before Grandma died. Once I understood what the records showed, I stopped debating whether to confront him. I printed the material, made additional copies, and called a family meeting. I told everyone I had information concerning Grandma's estate. Declan became defensive before I had even explained what I found. He said that if the meeting was about inheritance money, I was being disgusting and disrespecting Grandma's memory. My parents began scolding me immediately, but I placed the documents on the table and started passing them around. I pointed to the first transfer. Here is $50,000 moved from Grandma's account to Declan's personal account on January 10th. Here is the same $50,000 sent to BetKing 3 hours later. Then I showed them the next transfer, and the next, and the next. Every amount was supported by a corresponding date and destination. Declan lunged toward the table and tried to grab the papers, shouting that they were private banking records. By then, everyone had already seen enough. Grandma's brother, Uncle Gideon, had worked in law enforcement for years. He studied the records and asked Declan why Grandma's money had gone to online gambling while she was dying. Declan's explanation was so absurd that for a second the room went silent. He claimed Grandma had wanted him to invest the money for the family's future, and that gambling had been his investment strategy. Uncle Gideon stood up, crossed the room, and stopped directly in front of him. He did not touch Declan, but his posture changed into the controlled, intimidating stance he had probably used during hundreds of interviews. He asked whether Declan was seriously describing the theft of $200,000 from his dying grandmother as an investment strategy. Declan backed toward the hallway, sweating and unable to answer. Mom rushed between them and shoved her hands against Uncle Gideon's chest and accused him of threatening her son. Dad joined her, demanding that Gideon back away. I remained near the table, holding the records, watching my parents physically position themselves on either side of Declan like bodyguards. Aunt Patrice was crying near the fireplace. Other relatives spoke over one another, some asking questions, some expressing disbelief, and a few trying to defend Declan because they had not yet processed what the documents meant. Declan looked around the room, apparently searching for a way out. Then he bolted toward the front door, knocking Mom into the coffee table as he pushed past her. Uncle Gideon reached the door first and blocked it with his arms crossed. He told Declan that he was not leaving until he explained what had happened to Grandma's money. Declan tried to move around him, but Gideon stepped sideways and blocked him again. Dad then did something I had never seen him do in my entire life. He placed both hands on Uncle Gideon's chest and shoved him away from the door. Gideon barely moved, but the shock on his face was unmistakable. For a moment, I thought the two men were going to fight in the middle of the living room. Everyone fell quiet except Aunt Patrice, who was still crying. Marisol broke the silence. In the calm voice she used when discussing financial records, she explained that the transfers were not isolated. Near the end, Declan had moved money 3 or 4 times in a single day, especially after gambling losses. She had documented dates, times, amounts, and the progression of the activity. Mom turned on her instantly. She pointed a finger at Marisol and accused her of spying on Declan, violating privacy laws and betraying the family. Marisol did not raise her voice. She explained that bank employees who encounter suspicious patterns involving an elderly or vulnerable customer must document and escalate the activity under the bank's reporting procedures. She had not gone searching through Declan's finances out of curiosity. The transactions had appeared while she was handling Grandma's account activity, and she had recorded them because the pattern suggested exploitation. Uncle Gideon took out his phone and said he was calling a detective he knew who handled financial crimes involving elderly victims. Dad tried to snatch the phone from his hand, insisting that this was a private family matter and that police had no place in it. Gideon held the phone above his head while Dad grabbed at his arm. Aunt Patrice forced herself between them and begged both men to stop. That was when Declan dropped to his knees in the center of the room and covered his face. He began sobbing so hard that his words came out in broken pieces. He admitted he had a gambling problem. He said he had never intended for it to become so serious and believed he could control it. He claimed he planned to repay Grandma once he hit a major jackpot. According to him, he had been close to winning enough money to replace everything, and each loss convinced him that one more bet could repair the damage. My parents changed instantly. Mom knelt beside him, wrapped her arms around his shoulders, and rocked him as if he were a frightened child. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're sick. You need help, not judgment. We'll get you through this." Dad crouched beside them, placed a hand on Declan's back, and then stood to address the rest of us. He announced that Declan had admitted he was suffering from an addiction and said gambling addiction was a recognized mental health condition. He argued that anyone who truly loved Declan should focus on treatment rather than blame or punishment. I stood with the bank records still in my hand and asked whether anyone remembered that Grandma had lived in a freezing house and eaten the cheapest food available while Declan gambled away her life savings. Several relatives nodded. One cousin remembered Grandma complaining about the cold the previous winter. Uncle Gideon and Marisol both said her living conditions mattered because Declan had claimed the money was being spent on her care. My parents reacted as though I had said something unforgivably cruel. Mom accused me of lacking sympathy for Declan's mental health. Dad said I was choosing judgment over compassion. Uncle Gideon made the call anyway. He moved toward the kitchen and described the situation in a clear, factual voice. Suspected abuse of a power of attorney, documented transfers to gambling accounts approximately $200,000 removed over 6 months, and an elderly woman whose basic needs had not been met. Dad followed him, protesting that involving police would destroy the family. I remember thinking that Declan had already destroyed something far more important, but my parents could only see the consequences that might finally reach him. The front door opened while Gideon was still on the phone, and Declan's girlfriend Kendra walked in carrying 2 bags of groceries. She called out that she had brought the snacks Mom requested, then stopped when she saw the room. Declan was on the floor, with Mom wrapped around him. Dad stood nearby, looking ready to fight anyone who approached. Aunt Patrice was crying in a chair. Marisol and I were holding bank records, while several relatives looked as if they wanted to disappear into the furniture. Kendra slowly lowered the bags and asked what had happened. Dad stepped forward and told her it was a private family matter and that she should leave. Marisol walked over instead and handed her the transaction summary. She explained that Declan had managed Grandma's money through a power of attorney and transferred nearly $200,000 from Grandma's accounts to gambling sites. Kendra's hands began shaking as she read. Her face went pale when she saw the dates and amounts. She asked Declan whether it was true that he had taken money from his dying grandmother to gamble. Declan lifted his head and said it was not that simple. He repeated that he had a gambling disorder, that it was a disease, and that he had lost control. Kendra cut him off. She said she had loaned him $5,000 the previous month because he claimed he had a business investment that could not wait. She demanded to know whether that money had also gone toward gambling. Declan did not answer. Mom immediately told Kendra that this was not the time to attack him and insisted that a loving partner would support him through recovery. Dad said everyone needed to focus on solutions rather than punishment. Kendra looked at them as if she had entered a completely different reality from the ones shown in the bank records. Uncle Gideon returned from the kitchen and announced that Detective Renata Vale was coming to review the documentation and take statements. He explained that the power of attorney meant investigators would need to examine exactly what authority Declan had and whether he had violated his duty to act for Grandma's benefit. The direct transfers to gambling accounts, Grandma's declining condition, and the lies about her expenses created strong grounds for an elder financial exploitation investigation. Dad's face turned red. He ordered Gideon out of the house and accused him of inviting law enforcement into a personal disagreement. Gideon refused. He reminded Dad that Alma was his sister and said he would not allow her final months or missing savings to be erased to protect Declan. The living room divided almost physically. Gideon stood near the kitchen doorway and Aunt Patrice moved beside him. Marisol joined them with the records. Kendra looked at Declan one last time before crossing to our side. I was already there. My parents remained in front of Declan, creating a barrier between him and everyone demanding answers. A few relatives stayed seated, uncertain which side to choose. The doorbell rang and Dad announced that no one was opening the door. A woman identified herself from outside as Detective Vale and said she was there to take statements regarding suspected financial exploitation. Dad shouted that she could not enter without a warrant. Detective Vale calmly replied that no one was required to invite her inside, but she could take voluntary statements elsewhere and continue reviewing the documentation already reported. She added that making the process difficult would not make the records disappear. After another minute, Dad unlocked the door but attempted to block the entrance with his body. He said he would only allow her inside if he remained present for any conversation with Declan. Detective Vale agreed, clarified that the conversation was voluntary, and stepped inside. She was dressed in plain clothes, with her badge clipped at her waist. After surveying the divided room, she asked for a table where she could organize the information. Dad pointed toward the dining room and repeated that he would remain beside Declan. Detective Vale sat down, opened a notebook, and asked Marisol to explain how the transaction pattern had been identified. Marisol arranged the records chronologically. She began with the $50,000 transfer on January 10th, followed by the same amount sent to BetKing 3 hours later. She continued with $30,000 on January 25th, $40,000 on February 3rd, $25,000 on February 18th, and the many smaller transfers that followed. Detective Vale photographed the documents and asked whether the dates corresponded with any events in Grandma's care. Marisol produced a timeline showing that several transfers occurred on days when Declan claimed he was taking Grandma to appointments, buying medication, or paying household bills. Detective Vale asked about Grandma's living conditions. Family members described the cold house, generic food, limited clothing, and Declan's repeated claims that there was not enough money for better care. When Detective Vale turned to Declan, she asked him to explain why funds moved from Grandma's account into his personal accounts and then to gambling services. Declan sat straighter, wiped his face, and returned to his first explanation. He claimed Grandma had known exactly what he was doing and approved of the strategy, because he was trying to increase the inheritance for the family. Detective Vale asked whether he had any written authorization messages, notes, or witnesses supporting that claim. He said their agreement had been verbal, because Grandma trusted him and they had a special relationship. Dad nodded as if that settled everything. Mom squeezed Declan's shoulder. I interrupted and explained that Grandma had been experiencing early dementia during her final 6 months, and that the neurologist's records documented her cognitive decline. Detective Vale asked whether I could obtain those records. I said I would contact the medical office and follow the proper process for estate-related documentation. Uncle Gideon added that Declan had specifically used Grandma's increasing confusion as the reason she needed a power of attorney. He reminded everyone that Declan had told the family she was becoming forgetful and required someone responsible to prevent financial mistakes. Declan's face reddened. He insisted Grandma had asked for help because bills were causing her stress, not because she lacked capacity. Detective Vale noted both statements and asked him directly whether he had transferred approximately $200,000 from Grandma's accounts to online gambling platforms between January and June. Declan looked at Dad, who was already reaching for his phone. Then Declan said he wanted an attorney before answering any further questions. Detective Vale immediately acknowledged his decision and stopped questioning him. She explained that he had every right to seek legal advice and that the investigation would proceed through the records, witness statements, medical information, and bank documentation, whether or not he gave another statement. Mom told Declan not to say another word. Dad began calling a lawyer he knew from real estate matters and demanded that someone come over immediately because his son had been questioned without proper representation. Detective Vale gathered her notes, confirmed that Marisol's records would need to be obtained through official bank channels, and gave me her card. She asked me to contact her when we had Grandma's medical records or any additional documentation. Uncle Gideon walked her to the door. The moment she left, my parents began yelling at us. They accused Gideon, Marisol, and me of turning Declan into a criminal and humiliating him in front of the family. What struck me most was their choice of language. They did not say we were wrong about the transfers. They said we were wrong for revealing them. The following week became a blur of phone calls, records requests, and private conversations among relatives who wanted to understand what had happened. Uncle Gideon contacted family members individually and asked what Declan had told them about Grandma's expenses. We discovered that he had given different explanations to nearly everyone. He told one aunt that Grandma needed a specialized medication costing $3,000 a month. He told another uncle that her house required major repairs, including work on the roof and foundation. He told a cousin that Grandma wanted to prepay funeral expenses and purchase a premium burial plot. None of those stories matched, and the combined amounts exceeded even the $200,000 that had disappeared. Aunt Patrice took responsibility for identifying Grandma's actual expenses. She contacted the doctors, pharmacies, utility providers, home care services, and other businesses involved in Grandma's final months. After obtaining available bills and account records through the estate, she built a spreadsheet listing each verified expense: medical appointments, prescriptions, Home health assistance, groceries, utilities, and necessary household costs totaled approximately $30,000. That meant at least $170,000 had nothing to do with Grandma's care. Seeing the comparison made the betrayal even harder to absorb. Declan had access to enough money to keep her warm, well-fed, and comfortable, yet he had chosen to gamble while telling her those comforts were unaffordable. Marisol met with her bank manager, disclosed her relationship to the family, and formally explained everything she had observed. The manager reviewed the documentation and acknowledged that the pattern should have triggered stronger intervention sooner. The valid-looking power of attorney paperwork had prevented the automated system from treating the early transfers as obviously unauthorized. But that did not excuse the bank from examining signs of self-dealing and elder exploitation. The bank agreed to cooperate with investigators and authorized Marisol to provide an official statement about what she had documented in the course of her work. I also scheduled a consultation with a civil attorney named Lionel Barrett, who specialized in estate disputes and financial abuse involving vulnerable adults. I brought the bank records, Marisol's transaction timeline, Aunt Patrice's expense spreadsheet, the power of attorney documents, and every communication I could locate concerning Grandma's care. Mr. Barrett spent nearly an hour reviewing the material before discussing options. He explained that the power of attorney did not give Declan permission to use Grandma's money for himself. It imposed a fiduciary duty requiring him to act in her interests. The authority complicated the criminal investigation because prosecutors would need to prove dishonest intent and overcome Declan's claim that Grandma had approved the transactions. Civil action for breach of fiduciary duty, however, appeared more straightforward. The record showed Grandma's money being transferred for Declan's personal gambling rather than her benefit. Mr. Barrett believed we had a strong basis for seeking repayment to the estate. Then he explained the financial reality. Litigation could cost around $15,000, perhaps more, with no guarantee that we would recover anything if Declan had no assets. Even a successful judgment was only a legal obligation. Collecting from someone who was broke, unemployed, or heavily indebted could take years. I asked whether pursuing the case made sense. Mr. Barrett said the answer depended on our goal. If the only purpose was recovering every dollar, the economics were discouraging. If the purpose also included accountability and a formal record of what Declan had done, a judgment could matter, even if collection was limited. I called Uncle Gideon after leaving the office. He agreed to pay half the legal costs. He said this had stopped being solely about inheritance the moment we learned how Grandma had lived during her final months. We each provided half of the $7,500 retainer and instructed Mr. Barrett to proceed. Mom called that same afternoon crying and begging me not to sue Declan. She said the family was already shattered and that legal action would eliminate any chance of healing. I told her Declan had shattered the family when he took Grandma's money, lied about her care, and allowed her to live in needless discomfort. Mom accused me of being vindictive and warned that I would regret my decision when our relationships could no longer be repaired. Dad sent Uncle Gideon and me an email threatening to consult his own attorney about a countersuit if we continued what he called harassment. He listed ways our family had supported us over the years and claimed we were displaying extraordinary ingratitude by attacking Declan during his greatest time of need. Uncle Gideon forwarded the message to Mr. Barrett. Mr. Barrett said the threat appeared to be an intimidation tactic and advised us to preserve every email, voicemail, and text in case the pressure escalated. Within days, Declan hired a criminal defense attorney named Everett Shaw. Through his professional contacts, Uncle Gideon learned about the representation before my parents announced it. Mr. Shaw began communicating with Detective Vale and emphasized that Declan's gambling addiction had impaired his judgment and ability to control his behavior. Detective Vale later explained that addiction could be relevant to treatment sentencing or how a prosecutor evaluated the case, but it did not automatically erase intent. The extensive lies repeated, transfers false expense stories, and efforts to conceal the destination of the funds could demonstrate that Declan understood his actions were wrong. My parents embraced the addiction explanation as though it absolved him completely. Within a week, they were telling anyone who would listen that Declan was a victim of a disease who needed compassion rather than punishment. Mom posted publicly about supporting relatives struggling with addiction. She did not mention Declan by name or explain that the addiction had been funded with Grandma's savings, but everyone close to the family knew what she meant. Relatives who lacked the full story praised her courage and loyalty. Every supportive comment made me angry because my parents had turned themselves into heroic caregivers while Grandma's suffering disappeared from the narrative. Instead of arguing online, I began organizing the history we had ignored for years. I created a 12-page timeline of Declan's manipulation and my parents' enabling, beginning with the cheating incidents in high school. I included the drunk driving crash the replacement truck had, the failed business that consumed $20,000 of retirement savings, the missing cash and jewelry, the vanished tools, and the unused recording studio. I documented the different standards applied to us, consequences for my minor mistakes, explanations and rescues for his major ones. Marisol added her observations from family gatherings. She remembered Declan borrowing $200 from Aunt Patrice for car repairs that never occurred. He had asked Uncle Gideon's son for $500 to fund an urgent business opportunity that produced nothing. 3 Christmases earlier, he had borrowed $300 from our cousin Briar for rent and never repaid it. Once relatives began comparing notes, we realized Declan had operated small scams throughout the family for years. Uncle Gideon approached the process like an investigation. He privately interviewed relatives about money Declan had borrowed, promises he made, and explanations he gave. At least 8 family members had loaned him amounts ranging from $200 to $5,000 over 3 years. The combined total was approximately $30,000, and almost none of it had been repaid. Every person had heard a different urgent story: temporary cash flow trouble, a limited investment opportunity, a secret medical bill, emergency car repairs, or an accident he supposedly did not want our parents to know about. Uncle Gideon compiled the accounts into a spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and the specific explanation Declan used. We brought the material to Detective Vale. She studied the documents for a long time before explaining why they mattered. If the grandma situation were viewed alone, Declan's attorney could claim that a gambling addiction had spiraled suddenly beyond his control. The older incidents showed a long-standing pattern of calculated financial manipulation. Declan knew how to create urgency, target sympathy, tell different stories to prevent comparison, and delay questions until people felt embarrassed to ask. That history did not by itself prove every legal element of the grandma case, but it weakened the claim that his deceptive behavior began only after he became consumed by gambling. Somehow, my parents learned about Gideon's conversations. Dad sent an email to the entire extended family with the subject line, "Family Unity and False Accusations." He accused Gideon, Marisol, and me of conducting a witch hunt and manipulating vulnerable relatives into making statements against Declan. He said we refused to recognize addiction as a disease and were motivated by jealousy, bitterness, and money. The email ended with a plea for everyone to resist attempts to divide the family over misunderstandings. I read it 3 times, unable to believe how completely my parents had reversed the roles. Declan had taken the money, but we were accused of destroying the family for documenting it. Several relatives replied publicly with prayers for unity. Others contacted me privately to say they believed the evidence and supported accountability. The family separated into distinct sides, and each new message made the division more permanent. 3 weeks after the initial meeting, Mom announced that Declan had entered a 30-day residential treatment program for gambling addiction at a facility 2 hours away. She described his admission as proof that he was taking responsibility. Her message strongly suggested that we should drop the legal action so he could recover without the pressure of lawsuits. She included an article about the importance of family support and the risks of punitive approaches to addiction. I forwarded everything to Mr. Barrett and asked whether treatment changed our civil claim. He explained that seeking treatment did not erase a breach of fiduciary duty or eliminate the estate's right to seek restitution. Declan's attorney could present treatment as evidence that he was addressing his addiction, but it did not change the destination of the money or the conditions in which Grandma had lived. Mr. Barrett filed the lawsuit that week. It sought recovery of the missing funds, interest, and legal costs, bringing the requested amount to approximately $230,000. The complaint described Declan's authority under the power of attorney, his duty to use Grandma's assets for her benefit, the transfers into his accounts, and the subsequent payments to gambling services. 2 weeks later, Everett Shaw responded by arguing that Declan had no recoverable assets and that continued litigation would interfere with treatment. Financial statements attached to the response portrayed Declan as completely broke and deeply indebted. The defense requested dismissal or, alternatively, a delay until he completed treatment and established a stable recovery. Then my parents announced that they would pay his legal fees. These were the same people who had told me they could not contribute $1,000 toward a career certification because they needed to protect their finances. They had refused to help with my student loans in the name of independence. Yet they suddenly found money for attorneys whose job was to protect Declan from the consequences of taking $200,000 from Grandma. Mr. Barrett said their decision did not alter our claim, but it illustrated the same pattern that had allowed Declan to avoid consequences for years. Discovery began soon afterward. We requested Declan's bank statements, credit card records, employment history, debts, assets, and documentation of money he had received from relatives. His attorney produced boxes of poorly organized records. I spent several evenings in Mr. Barrett's office, sorting pages, matching dates, and highlighting transactions. We found restaurant charges Declan could not reasonably afford on his income payments to gambling companies operating under different billing names, large cash advances, and credit card balances that had gone unpaid. The record showed that the gambling was not one impulsive episode. It was a sustained pattern, involving multiple accounts and repeated efforts to obtain fresh money after previous sources were exhausted. Mr. Barrett scheduled Declan's deposition and requested documentation of his current employment living arrangements and any significant transfers involving family members. While reviewing the records, we discovered a $40,000 transfer made 3 months before Grandma died. The money had moved from one of Declan's accounts into an account belonging to Kendra. The memo described it as payment for business consulting services. I called Kendra and asked whether she knew why Declan had transferred $40,000 to her. She went silent. Then she said he had told her the money came from business profits and needed to be held temporarily in her account for tax reasons. Believing it was legitimate, she had already spent approximately $15,000 on a major car repair and her mother's medical expenses. When I explained that the money originated from Grandma's account, Kendra began crying. She said she had never known and promised to return everything that remained. Mr. Barrett determined that Kendra appeared to have received the funds in good faith without knowing their source. Her willingness to cooperate, however, added another important piece to the evidence. Declan had not merely gambled every dollar. He had moved part of Grandma's money into his girlfriend's account and disguised it as business income. Within 2 days, Kendra returned the remaining $25,000 and provided a written statement describing what Declan had told her. 3 days later, Declan began sending me messages. The first said he was sorry he knew had made terrible mistakes and wanted an opportunity to repair the damage. 20 minutes later, he sent another, accusing me of destroying his life and making recovery impossible. A third said that anyone who cared about family would drop the lawsuit and allow him to heal. Over the next week, I received around 30 messages that alternated between apology, self-pity, blame, and threats of emotional consequences. Declan said I was choosing money over my brother. He said Mom cried every day because of me. He warned that the stress might cause him to relapse and suggested that such a relapse would be my responsibility. I did not respond. I captured every message, saved copies in multiple locations, and forwarded them to Mr. Barrett. He said the pattern was useful because Declan's apologies were repeatedly followed by attempts to shift responsibility. Genuine remorse would have focused on Grandma, the estate, and restitution. Declan's messages focused almost entirely on how accountability affected him. After the messages stopped, Mom called me on a Tuesday evening. I could hear her crying before she said hello. She spent several minutes begging me to abandon the case. She said Declan had learned his lesson, entered treatment, and deserved the chance to rebuild. According to her, continuing the lawsuit served revenge rather than justice. I finally interrupted and asked one direct question. Declan took $200,000 from your dying mother-in-law and let her live without proper heat or decent food while he gambled. Do you believe that deserves consequences, or should he attend therapy and continue with his life? Mom was quiet, before admitting that what he had done was wrong. Then she added that he was sick. Punishment would not bring Grandma back, and a lawsuit could not restore the money he no longer had. She accused me again of choosing money over family. During that conversation, I accepted something I had resisted my entire life. Mom might acknowledge Declan's behavior in abstract terms, but she would never willingly allow consequences to reach him. Maintaining the relationship she wanted required me to participate in a reality where Declan was primarily a victim, and everyone demanding accountability was an aggressor. I told her I needed distance while I considered what relationship was possible. She cried harder and said I was abandoning the family. 2 days later, Dad sent a formal email titled Family Decisions and Consequences. He wrote that if I continued the lawsuit, my parents would consider me to have removed myself from the family. He listed the assistance they had provided over the years, part of my first-year tuition, before I earned scholarships. A car loan they co-signed when I was 22, and temporary housing between apartments. He gave me 1 week to decide whether I wanted to remain part of the family or continue what he called a path of bitterness and revenge. I forwarded the email to Mr. Barrett. He described it as further evidence of the pressure system that had protected Declan for years. That weekend, Uncle Gideon called and said he had been talking with Aunt Patrice and Marisol. They suggested meeting regularly so the people dealing with the consequences of Declan's theft and my parents' enabling would have somewhere to speak honestly. We began gathering every Thursday at Gideon and Patrice's house. At first, it was only the 4 of us. We talked about the latest accusations, compared memories, and reminded one another that expecting consequences was not the same as rejecting someone with an addiction. Marisol brought notes she had kept about Declan's behavior at family gatherings. Aunt Patrice made coffee and listened while we described the newest attempts to guilt us into silence. Gideon shared examples from his law enforcement career in which families protected destructive behavior until the damage became impossible to contain. Those evenings became the one place where I did not feel as though I had to defend reality itself. 5 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, Declan's full financial disclosures arrived. Mr. Barrett walked me through them page by page. Declan had no savings retirement account, real estate, or meaningful assets. The only property listed was a 7-year-old car with a broken transmission sitting in my parents' driveway. He owed approximately $70,000 to gambling services and personal loan companies, plus another $8,000 on maxed-out credit cards. He had been working part-time at a call center for 4 months, earning close to minimum wage and averaging around 20 hours a week. Before that, he had been unemployed for 6 months and living with our parents. Nearly every account showed missed payments collections or failed repayment plans. Mr. Barrett explained that even a complete victory would not produce immediate recovery. A judgment could follow Declan for years and allow future wage garnishment, but his current earnings might produce only $30 or $40 a month after legal exemptions and required deductions. At that rate, recovering $200,000 would take longer than any of us would live. I sat in Mr. Barrett's office staring at the financial statements and questioned whether continuing made sense. The original goal had included returning at least some of Grandma's money to the people she intended to support. If Declan had nothing, we could spend thousands more obtaining a judgment that existed mostly on paper. I called Uncle Gideon from the parking lot. After hearing the numbers, he said the case was no longer primarily about repayment. It was about ensuring that Declan could not walk away with therapy sympathy and another family rescue. Marisol agreed. She said dropping the case because Declan was broke would teach him that spending or hiding stolen money was an effective way to escape responsibility. At our next Thursday meeting, we spread the disclosures across Gideon's kitchen table and reviewed the options. Gideon reminded us that we had already uncovered a pattern reaching back years. Each time consequences approached someone, rescued Declan, or accepted his explanation. If we stopped now, being financially irresponsible would become his newest protection. I realized they were right. The case had become a boundary expressed through a legal process. Actions inside a family still had consequences. 2 days later, Mom called and said she had experienced what she described as a breakthrough in therapy. Her voice sounded exhausted rather than combative. She admitted that her favoritism toward Declan had harmed both of us. She said she had expected perfection from me, while excusing almost everything he did because she feared that holding him accountable would make him withdraw his affection. For the first time, she named specific incidents without minimizing them. She apologized for making me pay for the garage door while buying Declan a truck after his drunk driving crash. She acknowledged dismissing my academic achievements while celebrating his failed ventures as evidence of courage. She admitted that she and Dad had protected him so completely that they helped create a man capable of taking money from his dying grandmother. Hearing her say those things affected me more than I expected. I had spent years wanting nothing more than a simple acknowledgement that the double standard was real. For several minutes, the apologies sounded genuine. Then she said she hoped I would drop the lawsuit now that she was accepting responsibility. She wanted the family to move forward, support Declan's recovery, and build a healthier relationship in which both sons felt valued. The condition changed the meaning of everything she had said. She was prepared to admit that protecting Declan from consequences had caused enormous harm, but she still wanted me to protect him from the consequence directly in front of us. I told her I appreciated the apology and that hearing her acknowledge the favoritism mattered. I also said I needed sustained changes in behavior, not a single emotional conversation attached to a request. Dropping the lawsuit would repeat the exact pattern she claimed to understand. Mom began crying and accused me of being unforgiving. I remained calm and said an apology could begin repair, but it could not purchase immunity for Declan. We ended the call without agreement. I felt sad and emotionally drained, but I no longer felt confused. 6 weeks after the confrontation, Declan completed the 30-day treatment program. My parents organized a celebration dinner to honor him for taking control of his recovery. Mom invited the entire extended family and described the evening as an opportunity to recognize his courage. 2 days before the dinner, she called and asked whether I would attend. She said my presence would mean more to Declan than I understood. I told her I would not celebrate him for completing basic treatment only after being caught taking $200,000. Treatment was necessary, but it did not erase Grandma or transform accountability into cruelty. Mom said I was petty and incapable of letting go. Dad sent messages saying I had disappointed them again and chosen bitterness over unity. I did not attend. About a week later, the civil case moved into mediation. Mr. Barrett called that morning and explained that Declan's attorney wanted to discuss a settlement rather than proceed toward trial. We met in a conference room at a legal office downtown. Declan did not attend the initial negotiation. Everett Shaw represented him and explained that separating the parties often allowed practical discussion without another emotional confrontation. The proposal required Declan to sign a formal admission that he breached his fiduciary duty to Grandma and misappropriated her money for personal use. He would pay $200 a month for 10 years into an account designated for Grandma's intended heirs. He would also provide quarterly proof of continued gambling treatment. If he stopped treatment or missed required payments without resolving the default, the remaining obligation under the agreement could become immediately enforceable. Everett Shaw presented the offer as a realistic balance between responsibility and Declan's limited ability to pay. Mr. Barrett requested a break, and we moved into a smaller room. He calculated the total in front of me. $200 a month for 10 years amounted to $24,000. Only about 12% of what Declan had taken. Financially, it was insulting. Practically, however, it was probably more than wage garnishment would produce over the same period. Mr. Barrett said the most important term was Declan's written admission. It would establish that he had misused the power of attorney and taken Grandma's funds for personal gambling. The admission could not later be transformed into a misunderstanding or a generous investment plan. Proceeding to trial would likely cost at least another $10,000, and even a larger judgment would not create assets Declan did not possess. I called Uncle Gideon and explained the proposal. He put me on speaker so Marisol could participate. Marisol initially said $24,000 was offensively low compared with $200,000. Gideon agreed but reminded us that the objective had changed. The admission would become part of a binding legal record, could prevent Declan from credibly serving as someone else's financial agent, and would document what he had done in language my parents could not erase. After discussing it, we agreed that accepting the settlement did not mean the theft was worth $24,000. It meant we were choosing the consequence that could actually be enforced. The signing took place the following week in Mr. Barrett's conference room. Declan arrived with Everett Shaw and my parents. They looked as though they were attending a funeral rather than watching him acknowledge the misuse of Grandma's money. Mr. Barrett arranged the documents and reviewed each section aloud. He stated that Declan Mercer admitted breaching his fiduciary duty while acting under Alma Mercer's power of attorney. The next section stated that he had misappropriated approximately $200,000 for personal use, specifically online gambling between January and June. Declan's hand shook when he picked up the pen. Mom reached toward his shoulder, but he pulled away. He signed every page where his attorney indicated. There was no dramatic confession, no heartfelt apology, and no moment when he looked at me and admitted the full harm he had caused. There was only his signature beneath words he could no longer deny. Mr. Barrett collected the documents and prepared copies. Declan stared at the table. My parents glared at me as though I had destroyed his future rather than required him to acknowledge what he had done to Grandma. 3 days later, they called to discuss the payment terms. Dad said $200 a month would make it difficult for Declan to get back on his feet. He suggested reducing the amount to $100 or allowing my parents to make the payments for him. I reminded him that the agreement required Declan to satisfy the obligation himself, and that third-party payments designed to shield him from responsibility could violate the settlement terms. Dad accused me of being rigid and punitive. I told him that Declan had taken $200,000 while Grandma lived in the cold and ate generic bread. Paying $24,000 over 10 years was already an extraordinarily limited consequence. Mom took the phone and said I was choosing money over family, and that she had not raised me to be so unforgiving. When she began asking why I could not simply let everything go, I ended the call. 2 months after the family meeting, I wrote a clear set of boundaries for my relationship with my parents. I would attend major extended family holidays, such as Thanksgiving and Christmas, when appropriate. I would not attend smaller gatherings centered on Declan or celebrations for basic adult responsibilities, such as keeping a job, completing treatment, or avoiding gambling. I would not discuss the lawsuit settlement or Declan's recovery with my parents because every conversation turned into an effort to defend him and blame me. I sent the boundaries by email so they could read them without interrupting, and so there would be a written record. Mom called within an hour and tried for 20 minutes to negotiate. She argued that families were supposed to forgive and move forward together. I repeated that these were the conditions under which I could maintain any relationship at all. She warned that I would regret my rigidity when it became too late to repair things, then hung up, crying. The boundaries held, although Mom tested them repeatedly. She called every few days with a new reason I should make an exception. Declan was doing well in recovery and wanted me at his birthday. He had received a promotion and my parents were planning a small celebration. She sent photographs from gatherings I declined, adding captions about the precious moments I was missing. I stopped explaining and responded only when necessary. Dad respected the boundaries in practice, but made passive-aggressive comments whenever we met. At Thanksgiving, he repeatedly mentioned how pleasant family gatherings had been before drama and division. While I helped clear dishes at Christmas, he said family loyalty and forgiveness used to mean something. I refused to argue. I changed the subject or walked away. Uncle Gideon and Aunt Patrice became my strongest family connection. We began having dinner at their house every Tuesday, and they checked on me during weekends. Patrice sent jokes articles and ordinary messages that had nothing to do with the conflict, which helped more than she probably realized. Gideon invited me to baseball games, hiking trips, and other events he knew my parents would not attend. They also established their own boundaries. When Mom called Patrice and insisted that families should remain united no matter what Patrice told her, that unity did not require protecting someone from consequences. She said that if my parents had held Declan accountable earlier, Grandma might still have had her savings and live more comfortably during her final months. Mom hung up on her. The relatives who supported accountability remained close as well. Marisol and I began meeting once a month at a Thai restaurant halfway between our apartments. We talked about the years we had each spent doubting ourselves because my parents dismissed every concern about Declan as jealousy or drama. She had watched him escape consequences from the edge of the family, while I had experienced the double standard inside our home. Comparing our memories helped us recognize how thoroughly we had been taught to question our own judgment. Marisol eventually began dating a man named Felix who worked in her building. She introduced him to me before telling my parents because she wanted someone she trusted to meet him before they formed opinions or created pressure. Felix was kind, relaxed, and clearly cared about her. When Marisol finally told my parents after 8 weeks of dating, Mom immediately asked when they planned to become engaged and what kind of wedding Marisol wanted. Marisol calmly told her they had been together for 2 months and that she needed to slow down. Watching Marisol enforce that boundary reminded me that the family conflict had changed more than my relationship with my parents. Several of us were learning to stop giving them automatic authority over our decisions. 3 months after the confrontation, I started therapy. I carried anger over Declan's theft, grief over Grandma, and a deeper pain I struggled to name. My therapist helped me understand that I was grieving the fantasy of parents who would eventually choose truth over comfort. For most of my life, I believed that if I became responsible enough, successful enough, or patient enough, my parents would recognize the difference between my choices and Declan's. The Grandma situation should have been undeniable. Instead, they protected him more fiercely than ever. Therapy helped me accept that I could care about my parents while acknowledging that they might never become the people I needed them to be. Boundaries were not revenge. They were a way to stop participating in a system that required me to deny what I knew. Mr. Barrett later confirmed that Declan made his first $200 payment on time. The second arrived exactly 30 days later. Quarterly treatment verification showed that he was attending group meetings twice a week. I did not know whether he was genuinely changing or simply doing the minimum required by the agreement. Eventually, I understood that monitoring his sincerity was not my responsibility. The settlement required payments and documented treatment. His private recovery belonged to him. My responsibility was to honor Grandma's memory and protect my own peace. The most painful loss was not the inheritance. It was the final collapse of my hope that my parents would one day evaluate us by the same standards. I had spent years trying to earn approval through discipline, education work, and responsibility. Declan received protection regardless of what he did. When the clearest possible evidence appeared, my parents did not reconsider the pattern. They strengthened it. Accepting that truth hurt more than any amount of missing money because it meant acknowledging that nothing I achieved could force them to see us differently. Uncle Gideon invited me for coffee one Saturday morning after Declan's second payment arrived. We sat on his back porch, and he told me Grandma would have been proud that I stood up for her when doing so was difficult and lonely. He said Alma had spent much of her own life allowing relatives to take advantage of her kindness. Her sister repeatedly borrowed money without repaying it. Her brother once persuaded her to co-sign a loan and then defaulted. Grandma had confused forgiveness with permitting people to use her. Near the end of her life, she told Gideon that she wished she had developed stronger boundaries earlier. She said the people she respected most were those willing to do what was right, even when it cost them something. Gideon placed a hand on my shoulder and said I had shown the backbone Grandma wished she had developed sooner. His words did not erase my anger or repair the family, but they gave the struggle a meaning beyond money. 4 months after the confrontation, I hosted a Thanksgiving gathering at my apartment with Gideon, Patrice, Marisol, Felix, and several relatives who had supported accountability. We ordered pizza instead of cooking turkey because no one wanted to spend the entire day in the kitchen pretending everything was normal. Gideon told stories about Grandma that made us laugh. We played board games. No one mentioned Declan, my parents, the lawsuit, or the settlement. Celebrating without the whole family felt strange, but it also felt peaceful. There were no hidden accusations, no careful avoidance of obvious truths, and no pressure to praise Declan for surviving consequences he created. We decided to continue meeting for dinners and coffee, building a healthier family connection, rather than trying endlessly to restore something that had been broken for years. At Christmas, my parents sent a group message asking whether I would reconsider spending the holiday with them. I replied that I would visit for 1 hour in the afternoon but would not stay for dinner. To my surprise, they respected the limit. Mom sent a separate message saying she understood that I needed space and that she was continuing therapy. Dad stopped sending messages about loyalty. I did not mistake those changes for a complete transformation, but I recognized them as a beginning. Declan made his 4th payment on time. Each month, Mr. Barrett sent a confirmation, and I filed it without much emotion. I still did not know whether Declan had stopped gambling or simply become better at hiding it. I did know that his written admission remained in place, the payments were being tracked, and he could no longer claim that Grandma had enthusiastically approved an investment strategy. The truth existed outside our family's arguments now. Justice inside a family did not look the way I once imagined. Declan did not go to prison. He never delivered a sincere apology that repaired what he had done. My parents did not suddenly understand decades of favoritism and become completely different people. We recovered only a fraction of Grandma's money, and the payments would arrive $200 at a time for years. What I gained was less dramatic but more real. A legal admission that Declan had abused Grandma's trust, relatives who valued truth over appearances, boundaries that protected my sanity, and the knowledge that someone had finally refused to rescue the golden child from himself. Standing up for Grandma cost me the fantasy of having the parents I always wanted. It also gave me a family made up of people who could look directly at what happened and refuse to call silence love. In the end, that was not everything I had hoped to recover, but it was enough to begin living without waiting for my parents' approval.